Good morning. Today I shall tell you about strategies to get reliable switching in STT-MRAM cells. This is a work that is joint between myself, Thibaut Devolder, and my student Paul Bouquin, who was co-supervised by the Centre de Nanosciences et de Nanotechnologies in Paris-Saclay, France, and IMEC in Belgium, together with Sidatra. I will essentially discuss how to get reliable switching in STT-MRAM because this is very important, of course, in any memory technology to get reliable switching. And the first part of my talk will be about the backhopping problem in STT-MRAM cells. What is the phenomenology of backhopping? What is the scenario that is happening? And what we can do in terms of materials and countermeasures to suppress backhopping. And in the second part of my talk, I will discuss how to make the domain wall dynamics inside a STT-MRAM cell more reproducible. So I will discuss the switching paths. I will show that essentially the wall motion in STT-MRAM cell is oscillatory and happens in the so-called Walker regime, and that if we are smart enough, we can have the reversal, we can have the domain wall motion be ballistic, especially if we choose a device optimal diameter. So first, let's discuss about the backhopping phenomenon in STT-MRAM cells. STT-MRAM cells are magnetic tunnel junctions where all the magnetic layers have perpendicular magnetic anisotropy. There's a fixed layer system which is organized in synthetic antiferromagnet, and the free layer that has perpendicular magnetization. And in STT-MRAM, we operate the junctions by spin torque. That is to say that we apply a given voltage to the junction, and if we increase the voltage, we can switch the magnetization of the free layer so as to pass from a low resistance state to a high resistance state in positive bias, while if we go to negative bias, we can switch from high resistance to low resistance state. So this is the normal operation of STT-MRAM cells under spin transfer torque. If we make a writing experiment, then what we do is, instead of making a DC loop, we apply voltage pulses, and the switching probability can go from 0 asymptotically to 1 if we either increase the applied voltage or if we increase the pulse duration. So under normal operation, there's always an interest to increase the applied voltage or to increase its duration to increase the probability of switching and so diminish the write error rate. That's the normal behavior of STT-MRAM cells. Unfortunately, for some cells, there is a phenomenon that occurs which is called the backhopping, which was described here by Hu and co-workers, where if you increase the voltage a bit too much, the probability of switching, instead of continuing to increase, it suddenly starts to decrease, so that there is no benefit to increase the applied voltage any longer. And you have the backhopping where the system sometimes switch back to the initial state after the switching trial. Backhopping is seen in write error rate measurements, but in fact it can also be revealed at high voltage in quasi-static loops, and this is one example here, where if you start from low voltage, you increase the voltage, you have the normal transition from low resistance to high resistance, but if you go on increasing the voltage, you see an additional phenomenon where the system seems to switch back to a resistance close to the low resistance state. Okay. So this is either revealed at high voltage or at high temperature at more moderate voltage. And what we can see is that in addition to this parallel state, low resistance, and anti-parallel state, high resistance, there's an additional state that exists in positive bias that I will call the P-prime state. Okay. And what we will do here is try to understand why this P-prime state. It's been assumed in the past that backhopping was a problem of the free layer. So in order to test these assumptions, we'll grow magnetic tunnel junctions with variable free layers, but having all the same fixed systems. So I will use a conventional and usual fixed system that is split into two parts, one FCC part and one BCC part. The FCC part of the system is a hard synthetic antiferromagnet, where the hard layer is a cobalt platinum based multilayer, and it's exchange coupled through a texture transition layer to the spin polarizing section of the reference layer that is facing the MgO barrier. So that's the fixed layer. It's going to be the same for all samples in this study. And what we will do is, in contact with this fixed system, we will grow several distinct free layers. There will be the standard dual MgO free layers, but there will be also hybrid free layers where the cobalt iron boron will be coupled to cobalt through a texture transition layer, either tungsten or tantalum, and I will also discuss a bit about more fancy free layers that have a high volume and a low moment. And in order to study the backhopping phenomenon, what we will do is do this following experiment. I will apply voltage pulses, fast rising voltage pulses, and we will try to monitor in real time how the device conductance evolves from the initial state to and so in time, okay, to try to see when the switching happens and how it does happen. So in the conventional normal switching, when you do the experiments, so you start the pulse at time 0, the system stays sometime in the parallel state, and after a duration that is called the incubation delay, it switches to the other state, the anti-parallel state in this case. So that's indeed the normal behavior. If you increase the applied voltage, then the switching happens faster, of course, but this also comes with an extra cost. Indeed, if you let the current applied after the transition from P to AP, in fact, sometimes a backhopping phenomenon happens. So it happens after some time at large bias. Okay, and this was an example in this high volume and low moment free layer, but in fact it's rather systematic. Okay, and in all the free layer, for all the free layers that we've tested, this is happening to some extent at higher voltages or lower voltage, depending on the stack, but it's systematically happening. So the conclusion of this is that it doesn't depend much on the free layer. Okay, so it's not a story of the free layer, it's something happening in the fixed system. And what we will do now is try to make more detailed experiments to try to have an exact view of what is happening during this P to AP and then P prime sequence. Okay, to try to identify what is this final state. For this we will do single shot, large bandwidth, time resolved conductance measurements. So this is one example of such measurement where we start from the parallel state, we switch to the AP state, and then we switch to a different state here that we will call the P prime state. And if you look at the resistance level, you can see that the conductance of the final state is slightly different from the conductance of the initial state. Well, since it's a measurement, a large bandwidth measurement, there's some noise, so you might think that it's noise-based, it's different. So you can do the experiments many times and check that indeed it's systematic, that the resistance of the final state is not the resistance of the initial state. You can also do it with a higher resolution by reducing the bandwidth of the measurement, and indeed you can be absolutely sure that the resistance of this final state, that I will call P prime, is not the resistance of the P state. Though these two states are indeed different, and backhopping here dynamically creates a new state, P prime, that is a state that doesn't exist at remanence, because at remanence we have just P and AP states. So let's do some experiments to try to identify the nature of this P prime state. So for this, let's go back to the material composition of the system that we're studying. In fact, it's composed, as many tunnel junctions, it's composed of two parts. One part that is face-centered cubic, essentially the hard part of the reference layer, and one part that is BCC, which is essentially the barrier-facing layers, where in the section where we want high spin polarization. And they are separated by a texture transition layer, in our case, a 3 angstrom of tungsten. And this texture transition layer is thin enough to ensure that there is a direct ferromagnetic coupling between the SAF and the spin-polarizing cobalt iron boron part. Okay. But somehow, this exchange coupling is not as strong as we would desire, and it's only a few fraction of millijoule per square meter. And we have to compare that, for instance, to the coupling through ruthenium for the SAF, which is unbreakable. It's something like 10 times more. So if we think of the possible states, the possible magnetic configuration in these stacks, there are of course the stable states, the parallel state and the anti-parallel state, where the synthetic antiferromagnet is organized in an antiferromagnetic way, and the free layer is either parallel or anti-parallel to the fixed system. But in addition to these stable states, we can think of excited states where we frustrate the exchange across the tungsten layer here by flipping the magnetization of the spin polarizing section of the reference layer. So this brings us a situation that is like that. Okay? And if you look at this magnetic configuration from the tunnel barrier, so by just looking at the barrier facing layers, you have the impression that here we are like in a parallel orientation. So this state that I will call P prime must have a resistance that is not very different from the resistance of the parallel state. And there's another possible state which is similar in terms of reference layers, but we flip the magnetization of the free layer that I will call the AP prime state, which also will have a resistance that is slightly different from the resistance of this AP state. And so we conjecture that the P prime state that is observed experimentally is the switching of the spin polarizing part of the reference layer within the fixed system. So the question is now, if we prepare this P prime state dynamically, what's going to happen? Will it be stable? Will it stay there if the current stays on or not? Okay, so let me show you some experiments to discuss this question. So that's a first situation where we switch from P to AP and then back to AP prime, and the P prime state seems to be stable, okay, under current. Of course, if we relax the current to 0, then this P prime state will relax to AP, and the AP will also relax to AP. So even if dynamically we are in this P prime state, since it relaxes to AP, if we make a right error rate measurement, okay, we will see no signature at the end of this process, and there will be no right error. The problem comes if the P prime state is not stable enough. Okay, and this is indeed the case in tunnel junctions if we increase the voltage. Okay, that's one example, for instance, for dual MgO free layer, where we can see that the P prime state is now very noisy. And in some cases, it's so noisy that it's unstable, and the system can leave this P prime state to go to other states, AP prime, P, and then AP, and there's a sequence of switching that continues after the first P to AP transition. So the main experimental finding in this slide is that if you let the current on in this P prime state, then sometimes it stays there, but sometimes it evolves further, and then there's a sequence of transition from P prime to AP prime and P again, and this sequence can go on forever, and you will have many right arrows depending on when you stop the current. Okay. So the question is now what we can do to avoid this scenario, and so what we have to do is to prevent the switching of the spin polarizing section of the reference layer. So we have to increase the rigidity of this part of the stack. So increasing the rigidity can be done in several ways. First, we can increase the interface anisotropy to have it more hard. Okay. Then we can increase the coupling of this spin polarizing section to the rest of the reference layer by having more exchange coupling through the texture transition layer. And finally, what we can do is avoid that it evolves under spin torque by simply increasing the damping. So let's look now at the list of texture transition layers that are potential candidates to replace tungsten and to try to have better rigidity of the spin polarizing layer. So among the list of possible materials, there's the refractory metals and the alloys of refractory metals and cobalt, iron, boron. In the pure refractory metals, you can have reasonable coupling, but not extreme coupling, and you can have a reasonably high damping. But if you look at the alloys of refractory metals and cobalt, iron, boron, the coupling is direct exchange, so it can be much stronger. Okay, and if you use tungsten, if you use a heavy metal inside the texture transition layer, this will induce a large damping of the spin polarizing section of the reference layer. So as a result, we conclude that if you want to prevent backhopping, it's better within the reference layer to use a texture transition layer that is made of tungsten and cobalt, iron, boron alloy. Okay, and indeed, if you do that in tunnel junctions, as most of you have probably practiced, then you're effectively suppressing the backhopping. So this brings me to the summary of my first part. Backhopping is something you can see in right error measurements, but also in resistance versus voltage loops at high voltage. It's something that happens within the fixed system of a magnetic tunnel junctions. Okay. And it's very probably because there is the switching of the spin polarizing section of the reference layer. And if this reference layer is not stable enough, in addition to the parallel to anti-parallel transition, that is the one you want, you're going to have the creation of a p-prime state that doesn't exist at remanence. Okay, but when it's unstable, the system can go in a sequence of switching that will go on forever, so that if you stop the current at the wrong moment, you're going to have right errors. To mitigate backhopping, then the best strategy is to increase the rigidity of the spin polarizing section of the reference layer. Okay, and for this, the best material route is most probably to use a texture transition layer that is an alloy of tungsten and cobalt, iron, boron. So this ends the first part of my talk about backhopping. Okay. And I will now switch to the second part, where I will discuss the stochasticity of the switching when it's due to domain wall motion and how to reduce this stochasticity. So the switching path in STT-MRAM, it's always difficult to know what is the exact switching path, because if you make basic characterization just like hysteresis loops, the only thing that hysteresis loops tells you is that the switching is very abrupt. Okay, and you really need more elaborate measurements or modeling to know what is the switching path. If you model the system by micromagnetics, it's known for some time. Then the switching is happening through a domain wall process where a domain wall sweeps through the device. Okay. And it's been confirmed experimentally that the speed of the reversal, which is the speed of the domain wall motion, the speed increases if you increase the applied voltage. And it's also been shown that because it's a domain wall process, the domain wall moving at constant speed, if you increase the size of the device, then it takes more time for the domain wall to sweep through the device. So that the switching time is longer if we use larger devices. So smaller devices switch faster. So and in this part, I will try to see whether we can make the wall motion more reproducible. So we'll first do measurements in elongated stripes because that's the easiest case. And the experiment that I will do is once again to apply voltage pulses to try to trigger the transition from the anti-parallel to the parallel state. And what we will do is we will follow the conductance in real time. So soon after the pulse onset, the resistance of the device is slightly changing, but essentially for a long time, which is called the incubation time, there is not much happening. And then you will see that after this incubation time, the system switches and in a very oscillatory manner. And these are, for instance, measurements measured on elongated stripes, 300 nanometer long. And what you can see is that after the incubation delay, where nothing much is happening, the system switches, and you can definitely see that the switching is very oscillatory in nature. And I want to stress that these oscillations are real. They are not due to noise, because that's the kind of noise you have in the measurement. So these oscillations are much above the noise, and they show that indeed the wall motion is very oscillatory. And in fact, the wall is advancing, okay, in an oscillatory manner because it's a Walker-like propagation. Of course, in STT-MRAM, we are much more interested in circular disks. So I will show results on circular disk. First, at high bias, when we drive the system hard in order to switch in the nanosecond regime. So here are a few examples of switching curves, okay, where we follow the conductance. It takes an incubation delay of a few nanoseconds before the system switches, and it typically switches in a couple of nanoseconds. And if you look at the statistics of the incubation time and the transition time, these are essentially histograms that are not very rich, where you do not see much feature in the reversal curves. The things becomes much more interesting if you reduce the applied voltage and you make it close to the quasi-static switching threshold. And so these are 15 examples of switching curves on a tunnel junction. And what you can see is that, of course, the incubation time fluctuates a lot. Okay? But what you can see is that there are some switching curves where the resistance increases monotonically from the initial state to the final state, and this happens in a majority of cases. But in addition, there are other switching curves that look very different, where you have a big oscillation of the conductance when you cross the midway level. Okay. And if I zoom on some of these curves, these are what I will call the ballistic switching curves, which correspond to 80% of the case. In something like 20% of the case, the resistance curves show a strong oscillation near the midway conductance. And in rare occasions, typically 1%, we have several oscillations of the resistance at the midway level, yielding to much longer transition times, 8-9 nanoseconds instead of 3-4. So in the rest of my talk, I will try to understand why we have this variability of the switching time and why we have these three different populations of switching events. What are they? So for this, we performed micromagnetics at room temperature. And this is one example for an 80 nanometer disk. We plug in the current at time 0, then there is some incubation time until a domain wall nucleates and then sweeps regularly through the device. And then, depending on what happens when the wall is at the center of the device, we can have two different scenarios. Here is a scenario where the domain wall advances through the device, and when it arrives near the center of the device, it has a near block-like configuration. And in this case, the switching is ballistic. In contrast, if when the domain wall arrives near the center, it is in a nail-like configuration, then the wall is going to oscillate much more near the midway conductance. So this probably corresponds to the central oscillation case identified experimentally. And in rare occasions, when the wall arrives near the disk center, it slows down, and there's a block line, that nucleates within the domain wall, and then the wall makes a pause at the disk center for some time before it finally sweeps. And so you have then, in this case, multiple oscillations of the wall around the disk center. Okay. And I believe that these three situations that are modeled, that are obtained by micromagnetic modeling, corresponds to the ones that are seen experimentally. The ballistic switching, when the wall crosses the center in a block-like configuration. the central oscillation case that happens in the minority in 20% of the cases, and rarely, okay, the wall makes multiple swings about the disk center when there's a nucleation of a block line within the domain. The question is, in practice, how can we achieve reproducible switching and try to get an always ballistic behavior? So for this, we developed a collective coordinate model where we describe the wall with two parameters. One is simply the wall position across the disk, and another one is the magnetization orientation within the wall, either block-like or nail-like. Okay. So, and what we will do is we will analyze the wall trajectories in this phase space characterized by the wall position and the wall tilt. And for this, we can plot a phase portrait, which is essentially the energy landscape, a top view of the energy landscape and how it's modified by the spin torque. And so we can have all the wall trajectories, their position and the tilt of the magnetization within the wall. And you can see that there's essentially in this model two classes of trajectory, not three, but two. There's one class of trajectory, which is the green one here, where the domain wall passes ballistically through the disk center. And there's another one, which is this red trajectory, where the domain wall approaches the disk center, then it's in a nail state, and when it's in a nail state, it cannot directly cross the wall center, it cannot directly cross the disk center, it has to circumvent the disk center and make a big central oscillation before it can sweep. Okay. So what we can see here is that the slowing down and the oscillation of the wall near the disk center is related to the shape of the energy landscape, and essentially to the fact that when you have a wall at the center of the disk, it has a very different energy if it's in a nail state or in a block state. Okay. And so in order to suppress this slowing down of the domain wall at the disk center, we have to engineer the energy landscape. So far, I've been describing what happens for a disk of diameter 80 nanometer. And in the energy landscape, we were seeing that the block state had a smaller energy than the nail state. So the energy landscape was like a saddle shape. Okay. And this was yielding to this variability of the transition time. If we want to avoid this, we have to choose a situation where now the energy of a block wall and the energy of a nail wall are identical. And this is obtained for a device optimal diameter, okay, and with typical material parameters of STT-MRAM free layers, this device optimal diameter is happening for something like 40 nanometer. You can see that I've created an acronym that is easy to remember for me. Huh? Okay, so if we look at the energy landscape for this device optimal diameter, we can see now that the saddle shape has disappeared because the energy of a nail wall and the energy of a block wall are exactly similar. So in the phase portrait, we can see that the wall crosses the disk center in a monotonous, quasi-ballistic manner. So that now the wall motion is immune to the fluctuation of the tilt. And if indeed we do the micromagnetics at room temperature for a 40 nanometer disk for many events, we can see that they all switch the disk center ballistically. And so this brings me to my conclusion. STT-MRAM, the switching in STT-MRAM cells is involving domain wall motion happening in a Walker-like process. And both in experiments and simulations, we can identify three different scenarios. One where the wall crosses the disk center ballistically, another one where it makes a big central oscillation, and finally, in rare occasion, the wall swings multiple times about the disk center where there's a nucleation of a block line. We've developed a collective coordinate model that is able to describe the majority case and the ballistic case and the central oscillation case. And we've shown that if we want to suppress this central oscillation and have a reversal that is always ballistic, Okay, then we have to choose a device optimal diameter, and with this Devolder diameter, all the switching curves are ballistics, so that the transition times, instead of being widely distributed, is now very well reproducible. And of course, this is interesting for memory applications where reproducible switching time is sought. And with this, I thank you for your attention.